Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another gentle journey through history's quieter corners. Before we begin tonight's exploration, get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum we all love. If this kind of slow historical storytelling helps you drift off to sleep, consider subscribing, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And make sure to comment where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's wandering through history with us at this hour. Tonight, we're stepping into the bustling streets of medieval Europe, but not to witness grand battles or royal ceremonies. No, we're here for something far more ordinary, far more human. We're here to discover what fast food looked like when the world moved at the pace of horses and handcarts, when a quick meal meant something entirely different than it does today. Now, before we dive in, let's set aside our modern expectations. When you think fast food today, you probably picture McDonald's drive-thrus, golden arches, maybe a Starbucks coffee shop. You think speed, convenience, consistency. But in medieval times, fast food wasn't about corporate efficiency or global branding. It was about survival, necessity, and feeding people who couldn't afford the luxury of elaborate meals. Picture this. You're a medieval craftsman, perhaps a blacksmith or a carpenter. You wake before dawn, work until your hands are raw and your back aches, and you have neither the time nor the energy to prepare elaborate meals. Your wife might be working too, spinning thread, tending to children, managing the household. Neither of you has hours to spend over a cooking fire. What do you eat? Where do you go for something quick, filling, and affordable? This is where medieval fast food comes in, and it looked nothing like what we know today, yet served remarkably similar purposes. Let's start with the most common form of medieval fast food: street vendors. In every major city and town, from London to Paris to Florence, you'd find people selling prepared food from carts, baskets, or simple stalls. These weren't restaurants in any sense we'd recognize. They were often just individuals with a pot over a small fire, calling out their wares to anyone who'd listen. The most popular item: pottage. Now, pottage might sound exotic, but it was basically a thick stew or porridge made from whatever was available. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a hearty soup and sandwich combo. Vendors would simmer grains, usually oats, barley, or whatever was cheap, with scraps of meat, vegetables, herbs, whatever they could find or afford. It was hot, filling, and you could eat it with just a spoon or a piece of bread. A bowl of pottage from a street vendor was fast food in its purest form. No waiting, no complex preparation. Just ladle it into a bowl and there's your meal. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, it filled your stomach, and it cost very little. For a medieval worker earning just enough to survive, this was often the difference between eating and going hungry. But pottage wasn't the only option. Medieval cities also had what we might call the first grab-and-go foods. Bakers would sell small loaves of bread, often still warm from the oven. These weren't the refined white loaves we might imagine. They were dense, dark, made from whatever grain was available, sometimes mixed with things like ground acorns, or even sawdust when times were particularly hard. Here's where it gets interesting. These loaves weren't just bread. They were edible containers. Bakers would hollow out day-old bread to create what they called trenchers, essentially bread bowls. Then they'd fill these bowls with stew, vegetables, or meat. You'd eat the contents, then eat the container. No dishes to wash, no cleanup required. It was medieval fast food at its most ingenious. Now, if you wanted something even quicker, you could buy what medieval people called white meat, not chicken as we might think, but cheese, eggs, and dairy products. Vendors would sell hard-boiled eggs, chunks of cheese, and small meat pies that you could eat while walking. These were the medieval equivalent of grabbing a protein bar or a sandwich on the go. Speaking of meat pies, these were perhaps the closest thing medieval times had to our modern fast food burgers. Small handheld pies filled with meat, vegetables, sometimes both. They were cooked in advance, stayed warm for hours, and could be eaten without utensils. A medieval worker could buy one from a vendor, eat it while walking to his next job, and be satisfied for hours. But the real innovation was in the cities, particularly in London, where something remarkable developed. Cookshops. These were the world's first fast food restaurants. Though they bore little resemblance to anything we'd recognize today, a medieval cookshop was usually just a small room with a large fireplace and several pots constantly simmering. The owner would prepare large batches of simple foods: roasted meats, boiled vegetables, bread, ale. Customers would come in, point to what they wanted, pay, and eat standing up or sitting on simple benches. No tablecloths, no elaborate service, just quick, simple food for people who needed to eat and get back to work. What made these cookshops truly fast food was their approach to preparation. Everything was made in large batches and kept warm throughout the day. A customer could walk in and be served immediately, no waiting for food to be prepared to order. The meat was already roasted, the vegetables already cooked, the bread already baked. You ordered, you were served, you ate, you left. The entire process might take 10 minutes. And just like modern fast food, medieval cookshops developed their own version of standardization. A pie from one cookshop would be roughly the same size and price as a pie from another. A bowl of stew would contain similar ingredients, whether you bought it in the morning or the evening. It wasn't corporate standardization, but it was consistency born of necessity and competition. The customers were remarkably similar to modern fast food patrons too. Apprentices grabbing a quick meal between work shifts, travelers who needed something filling before continuing their journey, laborers who couldn't afford to take long breaks for elaborate meals, people who were busy, hungry, and looking for something convenient and affordable. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval fast food was how it adapted to local customs and ingredients. In coastal towns, you'd find vendors selling quickly prepared fish, sometimes raw and salted, sometimes grilled over small fires. In agricultural regions, vendors specialized in grain-based foods, thick porridges, and simple breads. In wine-producing areas, you'd find foods specifically designed to pair with the local drink. This regional variation was like having different fast food chains in different areas, each specializing in what the local population wanted and could afford. A medieval fast food map would show incredible diversity. Fish and oats in Scotland, wine and bread in France, beer and sausages in Germanic regions. Now, you might be wondering about hygiene and food safety, and, well, let's just say medieval fast food had some challenges that modern regulations have thankfully addressed. There were no health inspectors, no temperature controls, no refrigeration. Food was kept at room temperature, often for hours or even days. Meat might sit in the sun, vegetables might be wilted, and bread might be stale. But medieval people had developed their own food safety strategies. Heavy use of salt, which preserved food and killed bacteria. Lots of cooking. Most fast food was thoroughly cooked, which eliminated many dangerous organisms. And alcohol. Medieval people drank beer, wine, or ale with most meals because it was often safer than water. The result was fast food that might have been less safe than what we're used to, but was generally safer than the alternatives available to most people. A bowl of well-cooked pottage from a street vendor was probably healthier than whatever a poor family might cobble together at home. And the social aspect was remarkably similar to modern fast food culture. Medieval cookshops and food stalls became gathering places, spots where people would meet, share news, conduct quick business. Workers would cluster around popular vendors, eating and talking before returning to their tasks. It was community dining, but fast and informal. The economics was similar too. Medieval fast food was cheap food for working people. It wasn't a luxury or a treat. It was fuel, sustenance for people who needed calories to get through physically demanding days. A meal from a street vendor might cost the equivalent of what a laborer earned in an hour or two, making it accessible to most working people, at least occasionally. But there were also medieval versions of what we might call premium fast food. In larger cities, you could find vendors selling more expensive quick meals, better cuts of meat, white bread instead of brown, imported spices, wine instead of ale. These catered to merchants, skilled craftsmen, and others who had a bit more money, but still needed quick, convenient meals. The really wealthy, of course, had their own cooks and elaborate kitchens. Medieval fast food was primarily for the working and middle classes, people who had enough money to buy prepared food, but not enough to employ their own kitchen staff. As night settles in and you're drifting towards sleep, imagine those medieval streets for a moment. The smell of cooking meat and bread drifting from cookshops. Vendors calling out their wares in a dozen different languages and dialects. Workers stopping for a quick bowl of stew before heading home to their families. It was a world where fast food meant something different than it does today, but served the same essential human needs. The need for convenient, affordable nourishment in busy lives. The need for community and connection, even in brief encounters over shared meals. The need to fuel our bodies so we can continue with the important work of living. Medieval fast food may not have had golden arches or drive-through windows, but it had something perhaps more valuable. It was deeply rooted in local communities, made from local ingredients, and served real human needs in the most direct way possible. So the next time you grab something quick on a busy day, remember those medieval vendors with their pots of pottage and their bread trenchers. They were solving the same problem you are: how to eat well when life moves fast and time is precious. They just did it with fewer preservatives and a lot more shouting in the streets. Rest well, and dream of simpler times when fast food meant a warm bowl of stew and a piece of bread, shared with fellow travellers on the long journey of life. Now, get comfortable and settle in for tonight's journey. If you're enjoying this exploration of medieval cuisine, make sure to comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. As we drift deeper into the smoky taverns and bustling market squares of medieval Europe, we discover that fast food wasn't just about speed. It was about survival, community, and surprisingly sophisticated systems of food distribution that would make modern logistics managers weep with envy. The medieval world moved to rhythms we can barely imagine today. Dawn meant work, dusk meant rest, and the time between was filled with backbreaking labour that left little opportunity for elaborate meal preparation. This is where our medieval fast food vendors truly shone, creating an entire ecosystem of quick, portable nutrition that kept entire cities functioning. Picture, if you will, a typical morning in 13th century London. The sun hasn't quite crested the horizon, but the streets are already alive with activity. Bakers' apprentices rush through narrow alleyways, carrying enormous baskets of fresh bread still warm from the ovens. Their calls echo off the timber-framed buildings. Hot bread, fresh bread, 2 for a penny. These weren't your delicate artisanal loaves. Medieval bread was hearty, dense, built to fuel hard labour. The wealthy enjoyed fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour, but the common folk, and that meant most people, ate darker, coarser varieties. Brown bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains was the norm. It was nutritious, filling, and crucially, it stayed edible for days. But bread was just the foundation. The real magic happened when vendors began creating portable meals that could be eaten on the go. Enter the pie sellers, perhaps the most ingenious fast food entrepreneurs of the medieval world. Medieval pies were engineering marvels disguised as lunch. The pastry crust wasn't just decoration. It was an edible container, thick and sturdy enough to hold hot fillings without falling apart in a worker's hands. These coffins, as they were called, could contain anything from chunks of mutton and vegetables to eels caught fresh from the Thames. The beauty of the medieval pie system was its flexibility. A dock worker might grab a meat pie on his way to unload ships. A merchant travelling between towns could pack several pies in his saddlebags, knowing they'd stay fresh for days. Servants rushing between errands could eat while walking, using the pastry crust as both plate and utensil, and the variety was staggering. Lamb and herb pies for those who could afford meat, peas pies filled with thick pea porridge for the budget-conscious, fish pies on Fridays when religious law forbade meat, fruit pies when orchards were heavy with apples and pears. Each region developed its own specialties, creating a medieval food truck scene that was surprisingly diverse. But pies weren't the only grab-and-go option. Medieval fast food vendors were remarkably creative within the constraints of their technology. Take the frumenti sellers, mobile vendors who carried large pots of a hot, creamy porridge made from cracked wheat, milk, and whatever spices they could afford. They'd ladle it into bowls that customers brought from home, or into crude wooden cups for those eating on the spot. Then there were the cheesemongers, who understood that protein was essential for working people. They sold chunks of hard cheese alongside small loaves of bread, creating what we might recognize today as a medieval lunchbox. The cheese travelled well, didn't spoil quickly, and provided the fat and protein that manual labourers desperately needed. The drink sellers were equally innovative. Ale was safer than water in most medieval cities, so alewives, usually women who brewed beer in their homes, would carry jugs through the streets, selling cups of weak ale to thirsty workers. Wine sellers catered to more affluent customers, while those serving the very poor might offer buttermilk or whey left over from cheese making. What's fascinating is how these medieval entrepreneurs solved problems that modern fast food still grapples with. How do you keep food warm without electricity? Medieval vendors used ingenious warming boxes, wooden containers lined with hot stones or filled with smouldering charcoal. How do you maintain quality control when you can't refrigerate ingredients? They developed elaborate systems of guilds and regulations that governed everything from the quality of flour to the size of a standard loaf. The guild system, in fact, was medieval quality assurance on steroids. Bakers who sold underweight loaves faced hefty fines. Brewers who watered down their ale could lose their licenses. Pie makers who used spoiled meat might find themselves in the stocks, pelted with the very products they'd tried to sell. It was harsh, but it worked. Medieval fast food vendors knew their reputations were everything. And speaking of reputation, medieval fast food was surprisingly social. Unlike our modern grab-and-go culture, medieval eating was communal even when it was quick. Workers would gather around pie sellers, sharing news and gossip while they ate. Taverns served as informal community centres where people could grab a quick meal and catch up on local events. The cookshops, those primitive ancestors of restaurants, understood this social aspect perfectly. They'd set up benches outside their establishments where customers could sit and eat together. Some even provided entertainment, travelling musicians, storytellers, or performers who worked for tips and leftover food. Regional variations in medieval fast food tell us volumes about local culture and available ingredients. In coastal areas, fish pies and dried herring were staples. In grain-rich regions, various forms of porridge and bread dominated. Areas with good grazing lands specialised in meat pies and cheese. Wine regions offered grape-based preserves and dried fruits. The preservation techniques these vendors used were remarkably sophisticated. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation allowed them to keep ingredients fresh long before refrigeration. A good pie maker might have meat that had been salted weeks earlier, vegetables dried from the previous harvest, and herbs that had been carefully preserved through the winter months. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of medieval fast food was its efficiency. These vendors had to work within incredibly tight constraints: limited technology, seasonal ingredients, strict regulations, and customers who had very little money to spend. Yet they created a food distribution system that fed entire urban populations, provided employment for thousands of people, and laid the groundwork for food service innovations that we still use today. The medieval fast food scene wasn't perfect, of course. Food safety was a constant concern. Spoiled ingredients could and did kill people. Economic pressures meant that vendors sometimes cut corners, adding sawdust to bread or selling meat that was past its prime. The lack of reliable transportation meant that fresh ingredients were often scarce, especially in winter. But within these constraints, medieval fast food vendors created something remarkable: a system that provided quick, affordable, reasonably nutritious food to people who desperately needed it. They understood their customers' needs, adapted to local conditions, and created communities around shared meals. As you settle deeper into your comfortable bed tonight, imagine the smoky warmth of a medieval cookshop, the cheerful calls of pie sellers, the satisfying weight of a fresh loaf of bread in your hands. These long-ago entrepreneurs were solving the same basic human need that drives our modern fast food industry: how to provide good food quickly to busy people. The next time you grab a quick lunch, remember those medieval vendors who perfected the art of portable meals centuries before drive-thrus and delivery apps. They understood something we sometimes forget: that fast food at its best isn't just about speed. It's about nourishing communities, one meal at a time. Sleep well, and let your dreams be filled with the warm, yeasty scent of medieval bakeries and the cheerful bustle of ancient market squares, where the first fast food revolution quietly changed the world. Get comfortable now. Let your breathing slow, and make sure to comment where you're listening from and subscribe if this helps you drift off. We're continuing our gentle journey into the surprisingly sophisticated world of medieval fast food. And tonight, we're exploring something fascinating: how these early food vendors actually made their living, and why medieval fast food was really the backbone of urban life. Picture this: you're walking through a bustling medieval town at dawn. The air is crisp, maybe there's a light mist rolling off the river, and already the streets are coming alive. But here's what's remarkable: the very first sounds you'd hear aren't church bells or market criers. They're the calls of food vendors, setting up their stalls, lighting their fires, preparing for another day of feeding a hungry city. Medieval fast food wasn't just convenient, it was absolutely essential. See, most people living in towns and cities didn't have proper kitchens. Think about it. When you're renting a tiny room above a workshop, or you're sharing cramped quarters with 3 other families, where exactly are you going to cook a full meal? The risk of fire was enormous, fuel was expensive, and space was precious. So for the vast majority of urban dwellers, street food wasn't a luxury or a quick snack. It was how they survived. The economics were beautifully simple. A baker could wake before dawn, fire up his massive communal oven, and by sunrise have fresh bread ready for workers heading to their jobs. The cost of ingredients, spread across dozens of loaves, made each individual portion affordable. A pot of pottage could simmer all day, getting richer and more flavorful, while the vendor ladled out bowl after bowl to hungry customers. The setup costs were minimal: a cart, some basic cookware, maybe a small structure, or even just a designated spot on the street. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval fast food created some of the world's first franchise systems. Successful vendors would train apprentices, who'd eventually set up their own stalls, using the same recipes and techniques. Popular dishes would spread from town to town along trade routes, carried by merchants who'd tasted something delicious in one city and wanted to recreate it in another. The medieval meat pie, for instance, had dozens of regional variations, but the basic concept, portable, filling, eaten by hand, remained consistent across Europe. The specialization was remarkable too. In larger cities, you'd find vendors who did nothing but sell cheese, others who focused entirely on eggs prepared different ways, and some who became famous for their particular style of cooking fish. There were soup specialists, bread experts, and vendors who perfected the art of roasted nuts and dried fruits. Each had their regular customers, their signature preparations, their trade secrets passed down through families. The social aspect was just as important as the economic one. These food vendors were the information hubs of their neighborhoods. While you waited for your bread to be wrapped or your soup to cool, you'd hear the latest news, gossip about the nobility, updates on trade conditions, warnings about bandits on the roads. The food stall was part restaurant, part social club, part news center. Vendors knew their customers by name, remembered their preferences, offered credit to trusted regulars. Location was everything, just like in modern business. The best spots were near city gates, where travelers entered hungry and tired. Markets were prime real estate, especially on market days when farmers and merchants flooded in from the countryside. Near churches was excellent. People worked up an appetite during long services, and religious festivals brought crowds. Docks and harbours were gold mines, with sailors and dock workers needing quick, substantial meals. The medieval guild system protected these businesses too. Food vendors often belonged to specific guilds that regulated quality, controlled prices, and provided mutual support. If a baker fell ill, his guild brothers might help run his stall. If someone tried to sell spoiled meat, the guild would shut them down to protect everyone's reputation. It was an early form of quality control and professional standards. Seasonal variations kept things interesting and profitable. Spring brought fresh vegetables and early fruits. Summer meant longer days and more outdoor eating. Autumn was harvest time. Nuts, apples, hearty stews to prepare for winter. Winter foods were warming and substantial. Hot pies, mulled ale, thick porridges that could sustain people through cold, dark days. Successful vendors adapted their menus to the seasons, always offering what people needed most. The equipment was ingeniously simple but effective. Portable ovens that could be assembled and disassembled quickly. Cauldrons designed to hang over open fires. Wooden bowls and spoons that could be washed and reused. Everything had to be durable, portable, and efficient. Many vendors used the same basic tools their ancestors had used, refined over generations of trial and error. Credit systems developed naturally. A regular customer who was short of coins might promise payment on the next market day. Seasonal workers knew they could eat well during harvest time and settle their debts afterward. Vendors kept mental tabs, sometimes carved marks on wooden sticks, creating informal but effective accounting systems. Trust and reputation were everything in these small communities. The variety was astonishing when you really think about it. Yes, the ingredients were simpler than what we have today, but the creativity was boundless. Vendors found ways to make turnips appetizing, to stretch small amounts of meat into satisfying meals, to create dozens of different preparations from the same basic ingredients. Necessity truly was the mother of invention. Competition kept prices reasonable and quality high. If your bread was stale or your soup was thin, customers would simply walk to the next vendor. Word spread quickly in tight-knit communities. A reputation for good food and fair dealing could sustain a business for generations. A reputation for cheating or serving poor quality could destroy it overnight. These weren't just businesses, they were essential infrastructure. When harvest failed or trade routes were disrupted, skilled food vendors could stretch available ingredients, find substitutes, keep people fed during difficult times. They were the flexible, responsive part of the medieval food system, able to adapt quickly to changing conditions. And the tradition of passing down recipes and techniques through families created a kind of culinary continuity. The bread you bought from a vendor might be made using methods his great-grandmother had perfected. The seasoning blend in that stew might have been a family secret for generations. This wasn't just commerce, it was cultural preservation, keeping alive the tastes and traditions of the community. So as you settle deeper into your comfortable bed tonight, think about those medieval food vendors, the original entrepreneurs, feeding their communities one bowl at a time, creating the foundations of urban food culture that we still recognize today. Their simple stalls and humble carts were actually sophisticated businesses, perfectly adapted to their time and place. Tomorrow we'll explore the fascinating world of medieval food safety and the surprisingly innovative ways these early fast food vendors kept their customers healthy and happy. But for now, let the gentle bustle of that medieval marketplace fade into the distance and drift peacefully into sleep. While we've explored the vendors, the food preparation, and the bustling street food culture of medieval times, there's another fascinating layer to uncover about how these early fast food systems actually operated. You see, medieval fast food wasn't just about grabbing a quick bite and moving on. It was woven into the very fabric of social and economic life in ways that would seem almost unimaginable today. Think about your typical fast food experience now. You walk in, order from a menu, pay a standardized price, and eat food prepared by workers you'll probably never see again. It's efficient, anonymous, and predictable. Medieval fast food was almost the opposite, yet it served remarkably similar functions in society. In medieval towns, your local pie vendor wasn't just someone who sold you lunch. He was part of your community's extended family. He knew your name, your family, probably your financial situation, and definitely your food preferences. When you bought that morning's fresh bread or evening pottage, you weren't just making a transaction. You were participating in a complex web of relationships that kept the entire community functioning. These food vendors operated on what we might call a credit system that makes modern payment plans look simple. If times were hard, which they often were, your local bread baker might let you run a tab. Not because he was feeling generous, but because he knew that when harvest time came, or when your husband returned from whatever work had taken him away, you'd settle up. This wasn't written down in ledgers like we might expect. It was all based on memory, reputation, and the simple understanding that everyone in a small community needed each other to survive. The seasonal rhythm of medieval fast food was something we've completely lost in our modern world of year-round availability. Today, you can get the same McDonald's burger in January or July, in Maine or California. But medieval fast food vendors lived and died by the seasons in ways that shaped not just what they sold, but how entire communities ate and socialized. Spring brought fresh vegetables and herbs that hadn't been available for months. Vendors would appear seemingly overnight selling early greens, fresh cheese, and the first eggs from chickens who'd finally started laying again after the long winter. There was a genuine excitement around these seasonal offerings that we might compare to the way modern fast food chains hype their limited-time seasonal items, except this wasn't marketing, it was survival after months of preserved foods. Summer was the golden season for medieval fast food. This was when vendors could offer the greatest variety, when fresh fruits and vegetables were abundant, when travelling merchants brought exotic spices and imported delicacies. The streets would be alive with sellers hawking everything from fresh berries to grilled fish, from herb-crusted breads to sweet honeyed treats. It was the closest thing medieval people had to our modern food courts, with multiple vendors competing for customers and experimenting with new combinations of flavours. But it was during harvest time that medieval fast food truly came into its own. Imagine the modern food truck rally, but instead of hipster fusion cuisine, you had vendors selling fresh grain porridges, meat pies made from newly butchered livestock, and breads baked from the first flour of the season. The atmosphere would have been electric with the relief and celebration that came with a successful harvest. People who'd been carefully rationing food for months could suddenly afford to buy meals instead of making them, to try new dishes, to indulge in small luxuries. Winter, of course, was the lean season. Many vendors simply disappeared, unable to source ingredients or afford fuel for cooking fires. Those who remained relied heavily on preserved foods, dried grains, salted meats, and whatever root vegetables could be stored through the cold months. The medieval equivalent of comfort food emerged during these times. Hearty stews that could simmer all day, thick broths that provided warmth as much as nutrition, and dense breads that could fill an empty stomach when little else was available. The guild system that governed medieval fast food vendors was perhaps the most fascinating difference from our modern franchise model. While today's fast food workers are largely interchangeable employees following corporate scripts, medieval food vendors were skilled craftspeople who belonged to powerful organizations that controlled everything from pricing to quality standards to who could sell what, where. These guilds operated like a combination of labor union, trade association, and government regulatory agency, all rolled into one. If you wanted to sell bread in a medieval town, you couldn't just start baking and hope for the best. You had to apprentice under an established baker, learn not just the technical skills, but the social and economic rules of the trade, and eventually earn the right to set up your own stall or cart. The guild system created what we might recognize as the medieval equivalent of brand consistency, but achieved through completely different means. Instead of corporate training manuals and standardized recipes, you had master craftsmen passing down techniques through generations, guild inspectors checking the quality and weight of products, and community members who knew exactly what to expect from their local vendors. This system also created a form of consumer protection that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Guild regulations specified everything from the ingredients that could be used in different types of bread to the size of ale portions to the cleanliness standards for food preparation areas. Vendors who violated these standards faced fines, loss of guild membership, and exclusion from the trade. In some ways, these medieval food safety regulations were more stringent and more personally enforced than many modern health codes. The relationship between medieval fast food vendors and their customers was built on trust in ways that might seem quaint to us now. When you bought a meat pie from your local vendor, you weren't just trusting that it would taste good. You were trusting that he hadn't used spoiled meat, that he'd prepared it with clean hands, and that he wasn't trying to cheat you on portion size or price. This trust was maintained not through corporate oversight or legal contracts, but through face-to-face relationships and community accountability. If a vendor consistently sold poor quality food or cheated customers, word would spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Unlike today, where a bad restaurant might just lose some online reviews, a medieval food vendor who lost his reputation could be ruined. He might be expelled from his guild, banned from local markets, or simply find that no one would buy from him anymore. This created powerful incentives for honesty and quality that were enforced not by distant corporate executives, but by neighbors and customers who saw each other every day. The medieval approach to food innovation was also fascinatingly different from our modern fast food industry. Today's new menu items are typically developed in corporate test kitchens by teams of food scientists and marketing experts, then rolled out simultaneously across hundreds or thousands of locations. Medieval food innovation happened organically through individual vendors experimenting with available ingredients, responding to customer requests, or adapting techniques learned from traveling merchants or foreign visitors. A medieval baker might start adding a new herb to his bread because a customer mentioned enjoying it, or because he'd acquired some from a spice merchant and wanted to see if it would sell. If customers liked it, other bakers in the area might start offering similar products. If it failed, the innovation would simply disappear without any corporate losses or failed marketing campaigns. This organic approach to food development meant that medieval fast food was often highly localized in ways that modern chain restaurants deliberately avoid. A meat pie vendor in coastal areas might specialize in fish-based fillings, while his counterpart in pastoral regions would focus on lamb or beef. Urban vendors might offer more sophisticated spice combinations acquired from international traders, while rural vendors would emphasize hearty, simple preparations using locally available ingredients. The seasonal and regional variation in medieval fast food created a kind of culinary diversity that we've largely lost in our era of standardized chain restaurants. While this meant that quality and availability could be unpredictable, it also meant that food culture was deeply connected to place and time in ways that made eating a more varied and culturally rich experience. As we continue to explore the world of medieval fast food, we begin to see how these early food systems laid the groundwork for many aspects of modern food culture while operating according to completely different principles. The medieval emphasis on community relationships, seasonal availability, and local variation created a food culture that was both more personal and more precarious than what we know today. But the fundamental human needs that drove medieval fast food, the desire for convenient, affordable, tasty meals that could be eaten quickly by busy people, remain exactly the same. The solutions may have been different, but the underlying demand that created medieval street food vendors is identical to what drives our modern fast food industry. Sleep well, and let the gentle sounds of medieval markets fade into dreams, where the aroma of fresh bread and simmering stews drifts through the quiet night air. So get comfortable, make sure to comment and subscribe if you find these stories help you drift off to sleep. And let's continue our journey into why finding love in medieval times was truly a nightmare. We've explored the social constraints, the physical dangers, and the supernatural terrors that plagued medieval romance. But perhaps nothing made love more impossible than the brutal economic realities that governed every aspect of medieval life. Because in a world where most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation, where a broken cartwheel could mean financial ruin, and where your economic status was determined entirely by the circumstances of your birth, love was quite literally a luxury that most people simply could not afford. Picture this. You're a young peasant woman named Agnes, living in a small English village in the year 1348. You're 17 years old, which by medieval standards makes you practically an old maid, since most girls your age were married off by 14. But your father, a serf bound to the local lord's estate, has been struggling to scrape together enough resources for your dowry. Without a dowry, no man would consider marrying you, because marriage in medieval times wasn't about love or even compatibility. It was an economic transaction, pure and simple. Your father owns nothing. The land he works belongs to his lord. The tools he uses are borrowed. Even the cottage you live in could be taken away at a moment's notice if your family displeased their master. Your potential dowry consists of a few chickens, perhaps a pig if you're lucky, and maybe some household goods that your mother has been slowly accumulating over the years. A cooking pot, some rough cloth, a wooden chest. These items represent years of careful saving, of going without, of hoping that someday there might be enough to secure your future. But then disaster strikes, as it so often did in medieval times. The harvest fails due to too much rain, or perhaps your father falls ill and cannot work for several crucial weeks. Suddenly, those few precious items that were meant to be your dowry must be sold just to buy food to keep the family alive. Your marriage prospects, already dim, now vanish entirely. No dowry means no husband, and no husband means no security, no protection, no future. This wasn't unusual. This was the daily reality for the vast majority of medieval people. Love, romance, the idea of choosing your own partner based on affection and compatibility, these were luxuries available only to those wealthy enough to have their basic survival needs already met. For everyone else, marriage was about economic survival, and emotions were a dangerous distraction from the serious business of not starving to death. Even among the merchant classes, where there was slightly more wealth to go around, romantic love was viewed with deep suspicion. A successful merchant needed a wife who could help manage his business, keep his accounts, and produce children who would inherit and continue his trade. He needed someone whose family connections could open new markets or provide business opportunities. Romance was seen as a form of temporary madness that clouded judgment and led to poor decision-making. Consider the case of a fictional but typical merchant named William the Baker living in London in the 14th century. William has built up a successful bakery business through years of hard work and careful planning. When it comes time for him to marry, he doesn't go looking for the prettiest girl in the market square. Instead, he approaches the family of Margaret, whose father is a successful wool merchant. Margaret comes with a substantial dowry, family connections that could help William expand his business, and practical skills in managing household finances. The fact that William and Margaret have never had a meaningful conversation before their betrothal is completely irrelevant. The fact that Margaret finds William physically repulsive and that William is already in love with his serving girl is equally unimportant. What matters is that this marriage makes economic sense for both families. It consolidates wealth, creates business opportunities, and provides security for the next generation. But here's where the economic constraints become truly cruel. Even if William and Margaret had somehow fallen genuinely in love, even if they had met by chance and felt that spark of mutual attraction that we now consider essential to romance, their families would still have arranged their marriages based purely on financial considerations. Love was not just irrelevant to medieval marriage negotiations. It was actively dangerous, because it might lead people to make economically irrational choices. The Church, which controlled so much of medieval life, actually reinforced these economic priorities. While Christian doctrine taught that marriage was a sacred institution, it also emphasized that romantic love was a form of dangerous passion that could lead people away from their proper duties to God and family. Young people were actively discouraged from forming emotional attachments before marriage, and those who showed signs of romantic feelings were often subjected to harsh discipline designed to cure them of such dangerous impulses. For the peasantry, the economic constraints were even more brutal. Serfs were literally owned by their lords, and their marriages had to be approved by the landowner. A lord might refuse to allow a marriage if it would result in the loss of a valuable worker, or he might demand a hefty fee for permission to marry. Some lords exercised what was called jus primae noctis, or the right of first night, meaning they could claim sexual access to any bride on her wedding night. While historians debate how commonly this was actually practiced, the very existence of such a concept shows how completely the economic and social power of the nobility dominated every aspect of peasant life, including their most intimate relationships. The seasonal nature of agricultural life also created additional constraints on romantic relationships. During planting and harvest seasons, everyone worked from dawn to dusk with no time for courtship or even conversation. During the winter months, when there was less work to be done, families were often trapped together in tiny, freezing cottages with no privacy and no opportunity for young people to meet potential partners from other households. Travel was expensive, dangerous, and generally forbidden for serfs without their lord's permission. This meant that most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, severely limiting their options for finding compatible partners. You might fall in love with someone from the next village over, but if your lord refused to grant permission for the marriage, or if the economic arrangements couldn't be worked out between the families, that love was doomed to remain forever unfulfilled. The guild system that governed trades and crafts in medieval towns created its own set of economic barriers to romantic freedom. A young apprentice couldn't marry until he had completed his training and become a master craftsman, a process that often took 7 to 10 years. By the time a man was economically established enough to support a wife, he might be in his late 20s or early 30s. ancient by medieval standards. The woman he eventually married would likely be much younger, probably someone he had never met before the marriage negotiations began. Even when marriages were arranged for economic reasons, they often failed to provide the financial security they were supposed to guarantee. A business partnership between families could sour. A dowry might be lost to poor investments or theft. A plague could wipe out an entire family's wealth overnight. Medieval people lived with constant economic uncertainty, and this uncertainty poisoned even those relationships that began with adequate financial resources. The legal system provided no protection for women whose husbands squandered their dowries or failed to provide adequate support. Once married, a woman's property became her husband's property, and she had no recourse if he chose to drink it away, gamble it away, or simply lose it through poor business decisions. The economic vulnerability of women was so extreme that widowhood, despite its many hardships, was often the only time in a woman's life when she had any control over her own financial resources. The constant threat of war added another layer of economic instability to medieval relationships. A young woman might be betrothed to a man who seemed financially stable, only to have him conscripted into his lord's army and killed in some distant battle. The bride would be left with no husband, no support, and often no way to reclaim her dowry from his family. Alternatively, a war might devastate the local economy so thoroughly that even previously wealthy families found themselves unable to honor their marriage contracts. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, created particular chaos in the marriage market. With so many people dead, the economic relationships that had governed medieval society for centuries were suddenly disrupted. Some survivors found themselves unexpectedly wealthy, inheriting property from deceased relatives. Others lost everything when entire family lines were wiped out. The social upheaval was so dramatic that for a brief period, some people actually did marry for love, simply because the traditional economic arrangements had broken down completely. But this brief window of romantic possibility was quickly closed as society reorganized itself. New laws were passed to prevent social mobility. Wage controls were implemented to keep laborers in their traditional roles, and the church worked overtime to restore the old social order. Within a generation, the economic constraints on romantic relationships were as rigid as they had ever been. For those few individuals who did manage to find love despite these economic barriers, the challenges were far from over. A couple who married for love rather than economic advantage often found themselves ostracized by their families and communities. They might be denied inheritance rights, excluded from guild membership, or even banished from their villages. The economic consequences of choosing love over financial security could last for generations, affecting not just the couple themselves, but their children and grandchildren. The irony is that the medieval economy was actually quite sophisticated in many ways. There were complex systems of credit and banking, international trade networks, and even early forms of insurance. But none of this financial sophistication was directed towards supporting romantic relationships or individual choice in marriage. Instead, the entire economic system was designed to reinforce existing social hierarchies and ensure that wealth and power remained concentrated in the hands of the nobility and the church. The troubadour tradition of courtly love, which we discussed earlier, can be seen partly as a response to these crushing economic realities. Since most people couldn't afford to marry for love, they created elaborate fantasies about impossible romantic relationships that existed outside the normal economic constraints of society. The knight who loved his lord's wife, the lady who pined for a man she could never marry. These weren't just poetic conceits. They were expressions of genuine longing for a kind of love that the economic system made impossible for most people to experience. But even these fantasy relationships were ultimately shaped by economic realities. The courtly love tradition was primarily an entertainment for the wealthy. created by professional poets who depended on noble patronage for their livelihood. The stories they told reflected the economic anxieties of their audience. People who had wealth and power, but who still found their romantic choices constrained by the need to maintain their social and economic positions. As we continue to explore the nightmare of medieval dating, we'll see how these economic constraints combined with other factors to create a system that was designed to crush individual happiness in favor of social stability. The next time you complain about the cost of modern dating, remember poor Agnes, waiting for a dowry that would never come, or William the baker, trapped in a loveless marriage that made perfect economic sense. In medieval times, love wasn't just complicated or expensive. For most people, it was quite literally impossible. The economic machinery of medieval society ground on, crushing romantic dreams beneath the weight of practical necessity, turning human hearts into commodities to be bought and sold. And yet, somehow, love persisted in the margins, in stolen glances and whispered words, in the quiet rebellions of those brave enough to believe that their feelings mattered more than their financial prospects. But those rebellions, as we shall see, came with costs that few were prepared to pay. Get comfortable now. Let the weight of the day settle into your mattress like stones sinking into still water. Make sure to comment and subscribe if this helps you drift towards sleep. Tonight we continue our journey through the brutal realities of medieval romance. And we're about to discover how even the simple act of wanting someone could bankrupt your family, destroy your future, and leave you with nothing but regret. We've talked about the physical dangers, the social restrictions, the supernatural fears that plagued medieval lovers. But perhaps nothing was more crushing to romantic dreams than the cold, hard reality of medieval economics. Because in a world where most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation, love was quite literally a luxury that few could afford. Picture this. You're a young peasant man, maybe 20 years old, which already makes you practically middle-aged by medieval standards. You've caught the eye of the blacksmith's daughter, and she seems to return your interest. In our modern world, this might be the beginning of a sweet courtship story. In medieval times, it was the beginning of an economic calculation that could determine whether your family ate this winter. You see, marriage in medieval society wasn't about two people choosing each other. It was a business merger. When families arranged a marriage, they weren't thinking about compatibility or affection. They were thinking about land, livestock, tools, and trade connections. Every union had to make economic sense because survival itself hung in the balance. For peasant families, marriage meant combining resources in a world where resources were desperately scarce. A young man couldn't simply court a girl he liked. He had to prove that marrying her would benefit both families financially. Did he have access to enough land to support a household? Could he provide the bride price that her family would demand? Did he own the tools necessary for his trade, or would he be dependent on others? The bride price itself was often crippling. A family might demand livestock, grain, tools, or even years of labor in exchange for their daughter. For a young man already struggling to establish himself, these demands could mean a lifetime of debt. Many young men found themselves working for their future father-in-law for years before they could even think about marriage, essentially becoming indentured servants to their own romantic aspirations. And this was assuming the girl's family even considered him worthy of negotiation. Social mobility in medieval society was virtually non-existent. A peasant's son couldn't realistically hope to marry a merchant's daughter, no matter how much they might care for each other. The economic gap was simply too vast. Families guarded their children's marriageability like precious commodities, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were. For women, the situation was even more restrictive. A young woman brought a dowry to her marriage, essentially a payment from her family to her husband's family to take her off their hands. This dowry often represented a significant portion of the family's wealth. Families with multiple daughters faced financial ruin, trying to marry them all off appropriately. Some families simply couldn't afford to marry off all their daughters, condemning some to lives of spinsterhood and economic dependence. The pressure this created was enormous. Families would often arrange marriages for children who had never met, based purely on economic calculations made by parents or even grandparents. A girl might be promised in marriage at age 7 to a boy she wouldn't meet until her wedding day, all because the economic arrangement made sense to the adults involved. Consider the story of Marguerite, a merchant's daughter in 14th century France. Her father had built a successful cloth business, but when a rival merchant began undercutting his prices, the family faced financial disaster. The solution: marry Marguerite to the rival merchant's eldest son, combining the two businesses and ending the competition. Marguerite was 15 and had never spoken to the young man. She had been in love with a clerk who worked for her father, a gentle soul who wrote beautiful letters and shared her love of music, but her personal feelings were irrelevant. The marriage would save both families from economic ruin. The wedding took place as planned. Marguerite's husband was not cruel, but he was a stranger. The economic arrangement worked perfectly. The combined businesses thrived. But Marguerite spent the rest of her life wondering what might have been, stealing glances at her father's clerk when he came to deliver documents, their eyes meeting briefly across rooms full of people who would never understand the connection they had lost to economic necessity. This pattern repeated itself across every level of medieval society. Even among the nobility, where families had more resources, marriages were still primarily economic and political arrangements. A duke's daughter might be promised to a count's son to secure a military alliance, or to a wealthy merchant's heir to bring fresh capital into a cash-poor noble family. The higher the social status, the more complex the economic calculations became. Royal marriages were the ultimate example of this. Princesses were essentially valuable trade goods, sent to foreign courts to cement treaties and secure peace agreements. A princess might be betrothed to a prince she had never met, from a country whose language she didn't speak, all to prevent a war or secure a trade route. Her personal happiness was not just irrelevant, it was potentially dangerous if it conflicted with the political and economic needs of the state. But the economic constraints on medieval romance went beyond just marriage arrangements. Even the simple act of courtship required resources that most people simply didn't have. In our modern world, dating might involve going to a movie or sharing a meal. In medieval times, any romantic gesture had to be calculated against the family's survival needs. A young man who wanted to court a girl might bring her small gifts: a ribbon, a flower, perhaps a sweet pastry from the market. But even these tiny tokens represented significant expenses for families living at subsistence level. The money spent on a ribbon could have bought grain. The time spent picking flowers could have been used for essential labor. Every romantic gesture was a luxury that had to be weighed against basic survival needs. The seasonal nature of medieval life made romantic relationships even more complicated. Agricultural communities lived according to the rhythms of planting and harvest, and there was simply no time for courtship during the crucial periods when the year's survival was at stake. Young people might catch glimpses of each other at harvest festivals or market days, but extended courtship was impossible when every daylight hour had to be spent on essential work. This created a brutal irony. The times when young people were most likely to meet and feel attracted to each other, during festivals and celebrations, were often the times when families were least able to afford the luxury of romance. A harvest festival might bring together young people from several villages, creating opportunities for connections that would be impossible during the isolated work months. But families attending these festivals were often calculating every expense, and the idea of their children forming romantic attachments that might disrupt carefully planned economic strategies was terrifying. The guild system that dominated medieval crafts and trades created another layer of economic barriers to romance. Young men couldn't simply choose their profession based on aptitude or interest. They had to find a master willing to take them as apprentices, often requiring family connections or significant payments. A young man might spend 7 to 10 years as an apprentice, during which time he was forbidden to marry and had no independent income. This meant that by the time a craftsman was economically established enough to consider marriage, he might be in his late 20s or early 30s, ancient by medieval standards. The women available for marriage were often much younger, sometimes children who had been promised to him years earlier as part of business arrangements between their families and his guild master. The economic realities of medieval life also meant that love matches, when they did occur, often led to disaster. A young couple who married for love, rather than economic advantage, might find themselves unable to support a family. Without the carefully calculated resource sharing that arranged marriages provided, they could face starvation, homelessness, or social ostracism. There are records of young couples who eloped against their families' wishes, only to return months later, broken and desperate, begging for forgiveness and support. The romantic notion of love conquering all crashed hard against the reality of medieval economics, where survival required constant calculation and cooperation between extended family networks. The Church, despite its teachings about the sanctity of marriage, often supported the economic approach to romantic relationships. Priests understood that marriages based on sound economic principles were more likely to produce stable families and communities. A marriage that left a couple destitute was seen as irresponsible, even sinful, because it failed in the basic duty of providing for children and supporting the community. This created a theological justification for suppressing individual romantic desires in favor of family and community economic needs. Young people were taught that true virtue lay in accepting their family's choices for them, and that romantic love was a selfish indulgence that could lead to spiritual and material ruin. The legal system reinforced these economic constraints. In most of medieval Europe, women couldn't own property independently, couldn't enter into contracts, and couldn't make financial decisions without male guardianship. This meant that even if a woman fell in love with someone her family disapproved of, she had no legal means to choose that person as a husband. Her economic future was entirely dependent on the men in her life making decisions for her. For men, the situation was different, but no less constraining. While they had more legal rights, they were still bound by family economic obligations. A son who defied his father's marriage plans might be disinherited, cut off from the family trade, or expelled from the community. In a world without social safety nets, this kind of economic exile was often a death sentence. The seasonal feast days and religious festivals that provided some of the few opportunities for young people to meet and interact were carefully monitored by families for exactly this reason. Parents watched their children's interactions with the calculating eyes of merchants evaluating potential trades. A glance that lingered too long, a conversation that seemed too intimate, could trigger immediate intervention to prevent unwanted romantic attachments from forming. Even among the wealthy, economic constraints shaped romantic possibilities in profound ways. Noble families had to maintain their status through careful marriage alliances that preserved and expanded their land holdings. A nobleman who married beneath his station could find himself cut off from court society, losing access to the political connections that sustained his family's power and wealth. The dowry system created particular hardships for families with multiple daughters. Each daughter required a substantial dowry to secure an appropriate marriage, and families often had to choose which daughters would receive full dowries and which would be sent to convents or condemned to spinsterhood. These decisions were made based on the daughters' marriage prospects, not their personal desires or aptitudes. As we drift deeper into sleep, let the weight of these economic realities settle over you like a heavy blanket. Imagine the crushing responsibility of knowing that your romantic choices could determine not just your own fate, but the survival of your entire family. Picture the young lovers who glimpsed each other across crowded marketplaces, knowing that the social and economic gulf between them made their feelings not just impossible, but dangerous. In our modern world, we complain about the cost of dating, the expense of weddings, the financial pressures of modern relationships, but we can barely imagine a world where the simple act of falling in love could bankrupt a family, where romantic feelings were literally a luxury that most people couldn't afford, where economic survival trumped personal happiness so completely that love itself became a kind of rebellion against the natural order. The medieval approach to romance was shaped by the harsh reality that in a world of scarcity, every resource had to be carefully managed and allocated. Love, beautiful and powerful as it might be, was seen as a dangerous luxury that could disrupt the careful economic calculations that kept families and communities alive. And yet, despite all these constraints, love persisted. In stolen glances across market squares, in letters smuggled between households, in songs sung softly in the dark, medieval people found ways to express and experience romantic connection even within the crushing constraints of economic necessity. Their love was all the more poignant for being impossible, all the more valuable for being dangerous. As you close your eyes and let sleep take you, remember those long-ago lovers who faced not just social disapproval or religious condemnation, but economic ruin for following their hearts. Their courage in loving, despite impossible odds, speaks to something indomitable in the human spirit, something that no amount of economic pressure could entirely crush. The merchants have closed their shops. The guildmasters have locked their workshops. The dowries have been calculated and the marriage contracts signed. But somewhere in the quiet spaces between economic necessity and human desire, love endures, patient and eternal, waiting for a world that might someday value the heart as much as the purse. Sleep now, in a time when love is a choice rather than a luxury, when romantic feelings are celebrated rather than feared, when the economics of the heart need not bankrupt the soul. The medieval lovers rest at last, their struggles ended, their courage remembered, their impossible dreams finally free to flourish in the realm of memory and story. Part 8. The psychological warfare of medieval romance. Get comfortable and settle in as we explore another layer of why medieval dating was such an absolute nightmare. If you're enjoying these glimpses into history's darker corners, make sure to comment and subscribe. We've journeyed through the physical dangers, social restrictions, and supernatural terrors that plagued medieval romance. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of all was how the system deliberately broke people's spirits, turning the most natural human desire for love and connection into a source of psychological torment that lasted entire lifetimes. Imagine growing up in a world where you're taught from your earliest memories that your deepest emotions are fundamentally wrong, where the very feelings that make you most human are treated as evidence of moral corruption, where loving someone too much could literally damn your soul for eternity. This was the psychological landscape that medieval people navigated every single day. The Church's teachings created what we might now recognize as systematic emotional abuse on a civilizational scale. Young people were told that romantic desire was the devil's gateway into their souls. They learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their natural attractions as potential sins, to suppress and deny feelings that should have brought joy and fulfillment. Consider the internal torment of a young woman named Eleanor, whose story appears in 14th century church records. At 15, she fell deeply in love with a merchant's son named William. But instead of celebrating these feelings, Eleanor was consumed by terror. She spent hours each day praying for God to cleanse her heart of what she believed were sinful desires. When William began returning her affections, Eleanor became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through demonic influence. She refused to speak to him, avoided places where she might see him, and eventually begged her father to arrange her marriage to another man as quickly as possible, believing that her feelings for William were proof of her spiritual contamination. This wasn't unusual behavior. It was the predictable result of a system designed to make people fear their own emotions. The psychological damage went far beyond individual relationships. Medieval society created what modern psychologists would recognize as complex trauma responses on a massive scale. People learned to disconnect from their feelings, to view emotional intimacy as dangerous, to approach relationships with suspicion and fear rather than openness and trust. The constant threat of accusation created a culture of emotional surveillance where people monitored not just their actions, but their thoughts and feelings. Young men worried that showing too much affection might be seen as weakness or sin. Young women learned that any expression of desire could mark them as dangerous or possessed. Marriage itself became a psychological minefield. Couples were expected to care for each other but not too much, to find comfort in companionship, but never to lose themselves in passion. They were told that their love for each other should always be secondary to their love for God, creating an impossible hierarchy that undermined the very foundation of their relationships. The wedding night, supposedly the culmination of courtship, was often traumatic for both partners. Women received no education about sexuality beyond warnings, that physical pleasure was sinful. Men were taught that their desires were animalistic urges to be controlled rather than natural expressions of love and connection. Many couples spent their entire marriages feeling guilty about their physical relationship, approaching intimacy with shame rather than joy. The Church's teaching that sex was only acceptable for procreation meant that any pleasure derived from the act was potentially sinful. Couples were expected to feel reluctant about physical intimacy, to approach it as a duty rather than a celebration of their bond. This created a devastating cycle where the very activities meant to bring couples closer together became sources of guilt and separation. How could relationships flourish when the foundation of physical and emotional intimacy was treated as spiritually dangerous? The psychological impact on women was particularly severe. They were taught that they were naturally more susceptible to temptation, more likely to lead men astray, more dangerous when it came to matters of desire. A woman who showed too much interest in romance, who seemed to enjoy her husband's company too much, or who expressed any sexual agency risked being seen as spiritually compromised. This created what we might now recognize as learned helplessness on a massive scale. Women internalized the message that their natural desires were wrong, that their emotional needs were less important than men's, that their role was to submit and endure rather than to actively participate in shaping their romantic lives. The constant fear of supernatural punishment added another layer of psychological torture. People genuinely believed that their romantic choices could result in eternal damnation. The stakes weren't just social embarrassment or family disapproval. They were literally eternal suffering in hell. This created decision paralysis around romantic relationships. Every choice carried the weight of potential divine punishment. Should you marry for love and risk angering God? Should you submit to an arranged marriage and risk a lifetime of misery? Should you express your feelings and risk accusations of sin, or suppress them and risk emotional death? The medieval period also saw the rise of what we might call romantic perfectionism, the idea that true love should be pure, spiritual, and largely unconsummated. The courtly love tradition, while seemingly celebrating romance, actually created impossible standards that made real relationships seem inadequate by comparison. Young people were fed a steady diet of stories about perfect tragic lovers who died rather than compromise their pure affections. These tales were beautiful as literature but devastating as relationship models. How could any real marriage compete with the idealized passion of Lancelot and Guinevere or Tristan and Isolde? This created a cultural split between fantasy and reality that poisoned actual relationships. Married couples felt inadequate because their love wasn't as pure or dramatic as the stories they'd been told. The ordinary challenges of real partnership, disagreements, compromise, the gradual deepening of affection over time, seemed mundane compared to the sweeping passions of romantic literature. The system also created what we might recognize as trauma bonding on a societal level. When everyone around you is suffering from the same emotional restrictions, when the entire culture validates the suppression of natural feelings, it becomes almost impossible to recognize that the system itself is the problem. People adapted to emotional starvation by convincing themselves it was normal, even virtuous. They learned to find meaning in suffering, to see emotional pain as evidence of spiritual growth. This made it even harder to imagine alternatives or to work toward healthier ways of approaching love and relationships. The generational transmission of this trauma was perhaps the most insidious aspect of all. Parents who had been emotionally damaged by the system passed those same patterns onto their children, often believing they were protecting them. Mothers taught daughters to fear their own desires. Fathers taught sons to distrust emotional connection. Each generation grew up a little more disconnected from their natural capacity for love and intimacy. What should have been humanity's greatest source of joy and connection became instead a source of fear, guilt, and psychological fragmentation. The medieval approach to romance didn't just restrict people's choices, it fundamentally altered their capacity for emotional health and relational satisfaction. It created populations of people who were literally afraid to love fully, afraid to trust completely, afraid to be vulnerable with the people closest to them. This psychological warfare was perhaps more devastating than any of the physical dangers we've discussed because it attacked the very core of what makes us human. It took our greatest capacity for joy and connection and turned it into a source of torment and fear. The effects of this systematic emotional abuse lasted far beyond the medieval period itself. Many of the romantic anxieties and relationship difficulties that persist in modern culture can be traced back to these medieval patterns of thinking about love, sexuality, and emotional expression. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but how deeply embedded these patterns of romantic fear and guilt became in Western culture. The medieval world didn't just make dating dangerous, it made love itself seem like a threat to the soul. And that, perhaps more than any monster or plague, was the true nightmare of medieval romance. Sleep well, knowing that in our modern world, love is no longer considered a sin, and your heart is free to feel without fear of damnation. Get comfortable now, pull those blankets a little closer, and make sure to comment and subscribe if these gentle journeys through history's shadows help you drift away from the day. Tonight, we're delving deeper into the medieval world, where love wasn't just dangerous because of disease or social constraints, but because the very heavens themselves seemed determined to punish anyone who dared reach for happiness. You see, medieval people lived under what can only be described as a cosmic surveillance state. Every whispered endearment, every stolen kiss, every flutter of the heart was observed, catalogued, and judged by a divine bureaucracy that made modern governments look positively hands-off. The medieval church taught that God saw everything, knew everything, and had very strong opinions about what you did with your romantic impulses. But it wasn't just God watching. Medieval cosmology was populated by an entire hierarchy of celestial middle management, all deeply invested in your love life. Angels, saints, demons, and various spiritual entities formed a kind of heavenly intelligence network that would make any surveillance apparatus jealous. They monitored your thoughts, your desires, your dreams, and they kept meticulous records. Consider the plight of young Eleanor, a merchant's daughter in 14th century France. She had fallen genuinely, deeply in love with Guillaume, a travelling scholar who visited her father's shop. Their conversations about philosophy and poetry sparked something neither had expected to find: intellectual and emotional connection that transcended the usual medieval arrangements of convenience and survival. But Eleanor lived in terror that her feelings themselves were sinful. The church taught that passionate love, even for someone you might legitimately marry, was a form of spiritual corruption. Love was supposed to be dutiful, measured, focused primarily on procreation and social stability. The intense joy she felt when Guillaume smiled at her, the way her heart raced when he quoted verses, the dreams she had of a life shared in conversation and companionship. All of this was, according to her priest, evidence of dangerous spiritual weakness. Medieval theology had developed an elaborate taxonomy of sins related to love and desire. There was luxuria, which covered sexual desire beyond the purely procreative. There was amor concupiscentiae, love that sought personal satisfaction rather than divine purpose. There was the sin of loving a creature more than the creator, which meant that caring too deeply for another person could literally damn your soul. The punishment for these spiritual crimes wasn't always immediate or obvious. Medieval people believed in a complex system of divine justice that could strike at any moment. A couple who loved too passionately might find their children stillborn. A woman who took too much pleasure in her husband's company might be widowed young. A man who prioritized his beloved over his religious duties might suffer business failures, illness, or social disgrace. This created a psychological torture chamber, where the very emotions that made life bearable were also the emotions most likely to condemn you. Eleanor and Guillaume tried to love carefully, prayerfully, always asking themselves whether their affection was properly ordered toward God's will. They second-guessed every moment of happiness, every surge of desire, every plan for the future. The medieval concept of divine justice was particularly cruel because it operated on timescales that mortals couldn't comprehend. You might sin through excessive love in your youth and face punishment decades later. Your children might suffer for your romantic transgressions. Your great-grandchildren might inherit curses that stemmed from your grandmother's passionate marriage. This temporal disconnect meant that medieval people lived in constant anxiety about spiritual debts they might be accumulating without even knowing it. Every misfortune, illness, crop failure, accidents, deaths, was potentially evidence of divine displeasure with someone's romantic choices, either their own or their ancestors. The church reinforced this anxiety through elaborate systems of confession and penance, specifically designed to regulate romantic feelings. Medieval penitential manuals contained detailed questionnaires about sexual and romantic thoughts. Priests were trained to interrogate their parishioners about the intensity of their feelings for their spouses, the frequency of their desires, the nature of their dreams. Young people were required to confess romantic attractions before they could be acted upon. The act of confession itself was supposed to diminish the spiritual danger of love, but it also meant that your most private feelings became matters of ecclesiastical record. Your priest knew who you dreamed about, what you desired, how intensely you felt. This spiritual surveillance extended into marriage itself. Couples were expected to approach physical intimacy with reluctance and shame, viewing it as a necessary evil for procreation rather than an expression of love. Too much enthusiasm for your spouse's company was spiritually suspect. Married couples who seemed too happy together might find themselves the subject of religious scrutiny. The medieval church taught that true holiness required a kind of emotional detachment that was almost impossible for normal humans to achieve. Saints were held up as examples of people who had successfully conquered their capacity for earthly love, redirecting all their emotional energy toward God. But for ordinary people, this created an impossible standard that guaranteed spiritual failure. The result was a culture where love and guilt were inextricably intertwined. Every moment of romantic happiness was shadowed by the fear that you were disappointing God, accumulating spiritual debt, or setting yourself up for divine punishment. The very emotions that connected you to another human being were also the emotions that separated you from salvation. Medieval people developed elaborate strategies for trying to love safely. They prayed constantly for guidance about their feelings. They made pilgrimages to atone for romantic sins. They gave alms to demonstrate that their earthly love hadn't made them forget their spiritual obligations. They commissioned prayers and masses to protect their relationships from divine wrath. But perhaps most tragically, they often tried to love less, to feel less, to want less. Medieval literature is filled with stories of people who deliberately chose loneliness over the spiritual risks of a deep connection. Better to be safe and empty than loved and damned. The divine justice system that governed medieval romance was not just cruel in its punishments, but arbitrary in its application. The same God who condemned passionate love also demanded that married couples produce children, which required at least some physical intimacy. The same church that preached against excessive attachment also insisted that wives obey their husbands completely, which seemed to require emotional connection. These contradictions created a maze of spiritual hazards that were almost impossible to navigate successfully. You could be damned for loving too little, failing in your marital duties, neglecting your spouse's needs. But you could equally be damned for loving too much, allowing earthly attachment to compromise your relationship with God. Medieval people understood that they were trapped in a system designed to ensure their spiritual failure. The game was rigged against human happiness and everyone knew it. But they had no choice except to keep playing, to keep loving as carefully as they could, to keep hoping that somehow their particular combination of affection and anxiety would prove acceptable to the cosmic judges watching their every move. The psychological toll of living under such surveillance was enormous. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of people driven to madness by the impossible demands of loving safely. Some retreated into religious life, choosing celibacy over the spiritual minefield of romance. Others became obsessively scrupulous, confessing and reconfessing the same romantic thoughts, seeking impossible reassurance about their spiritual state. And yet, somehow, love persisted. Despite the surveillance, despite the threats, despite the elaborate theological machinery designed to regulate and punish human affection, people continued to fall in love. They found ways to care for each other that honored both their hearts and their fears. They developed a kind of spiritual courage that allowed them to risk damnation for the sake of connection. Perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about medieval romance. Not that it was so constrained and fearful, but that it existed at all. In a world where loving too much could literally cost you your soul, the fact that people continued to love speaks to something indomitable in the human spirit. So, as you settle into sleep tonight, remember Aliénor and Guillaume, and all the countless medieval lovers who dared to care for each other despite living under the watchful eyes of heaven. Their love was shadowed by fear, constrained by impossible rules, and threatened by divine punishment. But it endured quietly and carefully in the spaces between the prayers and the penances. The medieval world has passed away, and with it, the particular terrors that made romance such a spiritual minefield. But the courage of those who loved anyway, who chose connection over safety, who risked their souls for the chance at human happiness, that courage echoes still, reminding us that love, however dangerous, however watched, however judged, always finds a way. Sleep now, and let their quiet bravery watch over your dreams. Make sure you're comfortable tonight, perhaps with a warm drink nearby, and your softest blanket pulled close. Before we continue this journey through medieval culinary nightmares, make sure to comment and subscribe if these stories help you drift into peaceful sleep. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something oddly comforting about knowing others are exploring history's darker corners alongside you. We've explored the brutal realities of medieval romance, the crushing weight of social hierarchies, and the constant threat of death that hung over every aspect of daily life. But tonight, we delve into something that might seem mundane by comparison, yet was perhaps even more universally terrifying. The simple act of trying to find something to eat. Picture this. You're a weary traveller in 14th century Europe, your stomach growling after days on the road. You spot a cook shop in the next village, smoke rising from its chimney, the promise of hot food beckoning like salvation. You approach, coin in hand, mouth watering at the thought of a warm meal. But what awaits you isn't nourishment. It's a game of culinary Russian roulette where the stakes are your very life. Medieval fast food wasn't just bad, it was actively trying to kill you. And unlike the monsters and plagues we've discussed, this was danger you willingly put in your mouth, chewed and swallowed, often with gratitude. Let's start with the most basic element of any meal: the meat. In our modern world, we take for granted the cold chain of refrigeration, the careful inspection of livestock, the sterile processing facilities. Medieval butchers had none of this. They had salt, smoke, hope, and a disturbingly casual relationship with decay. A typical piece of meat sold at a medieval market might have been hanging in the open air for days, covered in flies, slowly putrefying in whatever weather the season provided. The concept of sell-by dates didn't exist. Meat was sold until it was gone, regardless of its condition. Butchers learned to mask the smell of rot with heavy spices, assuming they could afford them, or simply sold the meat anyway to customers who often had no choice but to buy what was available. The process of slaughtering animals was equally horrifying. Animals were often killed in the streets, their blood running into the same gutters where human waste flowed. There was no concept of sanitary slaughter, no understanding of how disease could spread from sick animals to humans. A cow with obvious signs of illness might still end up as someone's dinner, because wasting food was a luxury medieval people couldn't afford. But even if you were fortunate enough to get relatively fresh meat, the cooking process presented its own deadly challenges. Most fast food was prepared over open fires in poorly ventilated spaces, often by people who had never heard of food safety. Cross-contamination wasn't just common, it was inevitable. The same knife that butchered a questionable piece of pork would be used to slice bread. The same hands that handled raw meat would knead dough, all without so much as a rinse in between. The bread itself, that most fundamental of medieval foods, was often more dangerous than nutritious. In years when grain was scarce, bakers would stretch their flour with whatever they could find: sawdust, chalk, ground bones, even clay. These weren't malicious adulterations. They were desperate attempts to make the food supply last longer. But the result was bread that could cause intestinal blockages, poisoning, or simply provide no nutrition at all. Even when the grain was pure, the milling and baking process introduced countless opportunities for contamination. Grain stored in damp conditions developed ergot, a fungus that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and death. The condition was so common, it had a name: St. Anthony's fire. Entire communities could be afflicted simultaneously, turning a simple meal into a collective nightmare of madness and agony. The water used in cooking presented perhaps the greatest danger of all. Medieval people understood that water could make you sick, which is why they often preferred ale or wine. But cooking required water, and that water came from wells contaminated with sewage, rivers polluted with waste, or cisterns that hadn't been cleaned in months. Boiling helped, but medieval understanding of how long to boil water was inconsistent at best. Street vendors, the original fast food entrepreneurs, operated under conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. They cooked in portable cauldrons set up wherever they could find customers, often near markets or outside churches. These vendors had no access to clean water for washing, no refrigeration for storing ingredients, and no oversight to ensure their food was safe. They were essentially mobile disease distribution centers. Consider the plight of Eleanor, a pie vendor in 15th century London. Each morning she would wake before dawn to prepare her wares in a single room she shared with her family and their livestock. She would use water from the communal well, the same well where neighbors dumped their chamber pots when the night soil men didn't come. Her meat came from whatever the local butcher couldn't sell to wealthier customers, often scraps that had been sitting for days. Eleanor would roll out her pastry on a wooden board that had never been properly cleaned, using lard that had gone rancid weeks ago but was all she could afford. She would fill her pies with the questionable meat, whatever vegetables she could scavenge, and herbs that she hoped would mask any off flavors. Then, she would bake them in a communal oven that dozens of other bakers used, an oven that was cleaned perhaps once a year. By mid-morning, Eleanor would be on the streets, calling out her wares to anyone with coin to spare. Her pies, still warm from the oven, would seem appetizing to hungry workers and travelers. But each bite was a gamble. The meat might be tainted, the vegetables spoiled, the pastry made with flour that contained more sawdust than grain. Those who bought Eleanor's pies might enjoy a satisfying meal, or they might spend the next week writhing in agony as their bodies tried to expel the toxins they had consumed. Some might develop dysentery, spending their final days in excruciating pain as their intestines bled. Others might succumb to food poisoning so severe it would kill them within hours. The seasonal nature of medieval life made food safety even more precarious. In summer, the heat accelerated spoilage, turning questionable food into certain poison within hours. Vendors had no way to keep their products cool, so they simply hoped to sell everything before it became completely inedible. In winter, the cold might slow decay, but it also made it harder to tell when food had gone bad. Frozen meat might seem fresh when it was actually riddled with bacteria, waiting to multiply as soon as it warmed up. Preservation techniques, while better than nothing, introduced their own dangers. Salt was expensive. So many people used it sparingly, resulting in incomplete preservation. Smoking could mask the taste of spoilage without actually making the food safe. Fermentation, when done properly, could preserve food effectively, but when done incorrectly, it could create deadly toxins. The communal nature of medieval cooking created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Cookshops often served dozens of people from the same pot, using the same utensils, sharing the same cups. If one ingredient was contaminated, everyone who ate that day could become ill. Entire communities could be devastated by a single batch of bad food. Spices, when available, were often thought to have medicinal properties that could counteract spoilage. This led to a dangerous false confidence. People believed that heavily spiced food was safe to eat, even when the spices were merely masking the taste and smell of decay. The spices themselves weren't always pure. They might be adulterated with cheaper substances or contaminated during their long journey from distant lands. The guild system that governed medieval trades provided some oversight, but it was often more concerned with protecting established merchants than ensuring food safety. Guild regulations might specify the size of a loaf of bread or the price of ale, but they rarely addressed whether the food was actually safe to consume. Punishment for selling bad food was usually financial rather than focused on preventing future contamination. Even when people suspected their food was tainted, they often had little choice but to eat it anyway. Food was expensive and scarce, especially for the poor. Throwing away a meal because it tasted off wasn't an option when you didn't know where your next meal would come from. People learned to eat around the mouldy parts, to scrape off the green bits, to convince themselves that a little spoilage wouldn't hurt. The medical understanding of foodborne illness was virtually non-existent. When people became sick after eating, it was often attributed to an imbalance of humours, divine punishment, or evil influences, rather than contaminated food. This meant that dangerous practices continued unchecked, with no systematic effort to identify and eliminate sources of contamination. Religious festivals and market days created particular challenges for food safety. Vendors would prepare large quantities of food in advance, storing it without refrigeration for days before selling it. The increased demand meant that food was prepared by inexperienced cooks working under pressure, leading to shortcuts that compromised safety. The festive atmosphere also meant that people were more likely to ignore warning signs of spoilage in their eagerness to enjoy special treats. The poor quality of medieval fast food wasn't just a matter of unpleasant taste or mild stomach upset. It was a genuine threat to life that claimed countless victims. People died agonizing deaths from food poisoning, dysentery, and other foodborne illnesses that would be easily preventable today. Others suffered chronic health problems from consuming contaminated food over long periods. Yet despite these dangers, medieval fast food continued to thrive because it served a genuine need. People had to eat, and not everyone had the time, resources, or space to prepare their own meals. Travelers needed portable food, workers needed quick meals, and urban dwellers often lacked cooking facilities. The fast food vendors of medieval times filled these needs, even if they did so in ways that were terrifyingly unsafe. The irony is that while we often romanticize medieval life, imagining simpler times when food was more natural and wholesome, the reality was quite the opposite. Medieval fast food was a nightmare of contamination, adulteration, and decay, wrapped in the desperate hope that this meal wouldn't be the one that killed you. As you lie there tonight, perhaps feeling grateful for the safety regulations and health inspections that protect your food supply, spare a thought for Eleanor and countless others like her. They weren't evil or careless. They were simply trying to survive in a world where the choice was often between starving and risking death with every bite. The cookshop fires have long since died out. The street vendors have fallen silent, and their contaminated wares have crumbled to dust. But their story remains, a reminder of how far we've come and how precious our modern food safety truly is. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow's breakfast won't be a gamble with death, and that the simple act of eating safely is a luxury our ancestors could only dream of. The medieval feast is over. The last questionable pie has been consumed, and the dangers of the ancient kitchen have been laid to rest. Rest easy now, far from those deadly cookshops, where the only thing warming you is your blanket, and the only thing you need to digest are these stories from a thankfully distant past. Medieval fast food, the final feast. Make sure to get comfortable and let this final chapter carry you gently into sleep. As always, make sure to comment and subscribe. If this journey through medieval fast food has brought you peace, we've travelled far together, haven't we? Through the smoky cookshops of medieval London, past the pie sellers calling their wares in the pre-dawn darkness, alongside the travelling merchants with their wheels of aged cheese and barrels of salted fish. We've witnessed the rise and fall of guild-controlled fast food, seen how the seasons dictated what could be eaten quickly, and watched as social hierarchies played out in every marketplace transaction. But now, as our medieval feast comes to an end, let's take one final walk through these ancient streets. Let's savour the last tastes of this world, where fast food was not convenience, but survival, not choice, but necessity. Picture, if you will, the closing hours of a medieval market day. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows between the timber-framed buildings. The cobblestones are slick with spilled ale and scattered with onion peels, fish scales, and the occasional crust of bread tossed to the ever-present dogs and pigs that serve as the city's clean-up crew. Margaret, our pie maker, is packing up her remaining wares. 3 meat pies sit unsold in her basket, their crusts now cold and slightly harder than they were at dawn, but still edible, still nourishing. In our modern world, these would likely be discarded, but in Margaret's time, nothing edible goes to waste. These pies will become tomorrow's breakfast for her own family, or perhaps she'll trade them to the baker down the street for a loaf of day-old bread. The contrast with today's fast food couldn't be starker, where we expect our meals to be consistently hot, uniformly prepared, and available at any hour. Medieval fast food operated on entirely different principles. Temperature was negotiable. Consistency was a luxury. Availability depended on the whims of weather, warfare, and the agricultural calendar. Yet there was something profound in this system that we've lost in our modern efficiency. Every transaction was personal. Margaret knew her customers by name, knew their preferences, their financial situations, their family circumstances. When young Thomas, the apprentice carpenter, couldn't afford a full pie, she might slip him the broken pieces for half price, knowing his master fed him poorly. When the widow Eleanor came by with her meagre coins, Margaret might add an extra spoonful of filling, remembering her own struggles as a young mother. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was community survival. In a world where crop failure, disease, or conflict could devastate a neighbourhood overnight, these networks of mutual support weren't just kindness. They were insurance policies written in pastry and goodwill. The guild regulations we explored earlier, those seemingly restrictive rules about who could sell what and where, served this same function. Yes, they limited competition and maintained social hierarchies, but they also ensured that communities had reliable access to food, that quality standards were maintained without government oversight, and that knowledge was passed down through generations of craftsmen. Consider the complexity of medieval bread regulation. The assize of bread, established in England in the 13th century, tied the price and weight of loaves directly to the cost of grain. When wheat prices rose, bakers couldn't simply charge more, they had to make smaller loaves. This protected consumers from price gouging while ensuring bakers could stay in business. It was a sophisticated economic system, disguised as simple guild rules. This interconnectedness extended to the very ingredients of medieval fast food. That wheel of cheese sold by a travelling merchant represented months of work by dairy farmers, cheesemakers, and the merchant himself. The grain in Margaret's pie crust connected her business to farmers miles away, to millers who ground the wheat, to the complex web of relationships that moved food from field to city. Even the spices that occasionally graced these simple meals told stories of international trade, of merchants risking their lives to cross continents, of exotic lands and foreign cultures. A pinch of pepper in a meat pie wasn't just seasoning, it was globalization in its earliest form, connecting a humble medieval fast food meal to spice gardens in distant India. The preservation techniques that made fast food possible were marvels of pre-industrial chemistry. Smoking, salting, fermentation. These weren't just food preparation methods. They were technologies that allowed communities to survive winter, to weather poor harvests, to maintain nutrition when fresh food was scarce. The salted fish sold by street vendors represented humanity's ongoing battle against spoilage and hunger, fought with nothing but salt, smoke, and ingenuity. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval fast food culture understood something we've forgotten: the deep connection between food and time. Not just cooking time or serving time, but seasonal time, agricultural time, the rhythm of life itself. Spring brought fresh herbs and early vegetables, eagerly incorporated into pies and stews after months of preserved foods. Summer meant abundance, but also urgency. Fresh foods had to be consumed quickly or preserved for the lean months ahead. Autumn was harvest time, when grains and fruits were processed into the preserved foods that would sustain communities through winter. And winter itself was the season of preserved foods, of salted meats and aged cheeses, of carefully rationed stores that meant the difference between survival and starvation. Modern fast food exists outside these rhythms. We can have strawberries in December, fresh lettuce in February, foods from any season at any time. This is undoubtedly convenient, but it's also disconnected us from the natural cycles that governed human nutrition for millennia. Medieval people understood hunger in ways we've largely forgotten. Not just the immediate hunger of missing a meal, but the deep, seasonal hunger of communities stretching their food stores through late winter, the anxious hunger of watching crops grow and praying for good weather, the desperate hunger of siege or crop failure. This understanding shaped every aspect of their fast food culture. Waste was unthinkable. Spoilage was catastrophic. Every crust, every bone, every scrap had value. Bones were boiled for broth. Meat scraps became sausages. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or soup thickener. The circular economy we're trying to build today was simply how medieval people lived. The social aspect of medieval fast food also differs dramatically from our modern experience. Where today's fast food is often consumed quickly, alone, while multitasking, medieval fast food was inherently social. Markets were community gathering places where news was shared, relationships were maintained, and social hierarchies were negotiated. The simple act of buying a pie involved complex social calculations: which vendor to patronize, how to balance quality, price, and social relationships, whether to eat immediately or save for later. These decisions were embedded in webs of community obligation and mutual dependence that made every transaction meaningful. Even the physical experience of eating was different. Without modern dental care, people ate more slowly, more carefully. Without standardized utensils, eating required attention and skill. Without climate control, the temperature of food was less important than its nutritional value and keeping qualities. The spices and seasonings available to medieval fast food vendors tell their own story of global trade and cultural exchange. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Spice Islands. These precious commodities made their way into humble street food, connecting local economies to international markets in ways that prefigured our modern global food system. But spices weren't just about flavor. They were medicine, preservatives, status symbols, and economic drivers. A vendor who could afford to spice his pies was demonstrating both his prosperity and his customers' sophistication. The absence of spices marked food as utilitarian, survival-focused rather than pleasure-seeking. The brewing industry that supported medieval fast food culture was equally complex. Ale and beer weren't just beverages. They were liquid bread, providing calories and nutrition while being safer to drink than water in many circumstances. The low alcohol content made them suitable for all-day consumption by people of all ages, while the brewing process created a preserved, portable form of grain nutrition. Small beer, the weak brew consumed daily by medieval people, contained B vitamins, amino acids, and carbohydrates that supplemented often limited diets. Brewers were essential community members, not just for their social role, but for their nutritional contribution to community health. The technology of medieval fast food, while primitive by modern standards, was ingeniously adapted to its circumstances. Portable ovens allowed bakers to set up shop in markets. Insulated containers kept foods warm during transport. Standardized measures ensured fair trade. These innovations weren't driven by venture capital or research and development departments. They emerged from the practical needs of people trying to make a living feeding their communities. The preservation techniques that made medieval fast food possible represent thousands of years of human innovation. Smoking, which adds flavor while preventing spoilage. Salting, which draws out moisture and creates hostile environments for bacteria. Fermentation, which not only preserves food, but creates new flavors and nutritional profiles. These techniques were passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, adapted to local conditions and available ingredients. They represent a vast library of food knowledge that we're only beginning to appreciate as we grapple with modern concerns about food security and sustainability. The seasonal nature of medieval fast food also created a rhythm of anticipation and celebration that we've largely lost. The first fresh herbs of spring, the first fruits of summer, the harvest festivals of autumn. These weren't just agricultural milestones, but community celebrations centered around food. Street vendors and cookshop operators were key participants in these celebrations, creating special foods for festivals, adapting their offerings to seasonal ingredients, helping communities mark the passage of time through food. This seasonal awareness also created a sophisticated understanding of nutrition that we're rediscovering today. Medieval people intuitively understood that preserved foods needed to be supplemented with fresh ingredients when available, that different seasons required different types of nutrition, that food variety was essential for health. The economic impact of medieval fast food extended far beyond individual transactions. These businesses were training grounds for entrepreneurs, stepping stones for people trying to improve their economic circumstances, sources of employment for widows and unmarried women who had few other options for independent income. The guild system, while restrictive in some ways, also provided economic protection and quality assurance. Guild membership offered social security, business networks, and standardized training that benefited both producers and consumers. The regulation of medieval fast food, through guild rules and municipal ordinances, represented early attempts at food safety, fair trade, and consumer protection. While the enforcement mechanisms were sometimes harsh, the underlying principles that food should be wholesome, fairly priced, and honestly represented remain relevant today. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval fast food culture, it's worth reflecting on what we've gained and lost in our modern transformation of food systems. We've gained convenience, consistency, safety, and variety beyond medieval imagination. We can eat foods from around the world at any time of year, prepared to exacting standards, available at predictable prices. But we've also lost the deep community connections that made medieval fast food more than just sustenance. We've lost the seasonal rhythms that connected us to natural cycles. We've lost the understanding of food as a precious resource requiring careful stewardship. We've lost the knowledge of preservation and preparation techniques that sustained human communities for millennia. Perhaps most significantly, we've lost the understanding that food is inherently social, that meals connect us not just to nutrition, but to each other, to our communities, to the natural world that sustains us. The medieval fast food vendors we've met, Margaret the pie maker, Thomas the travelling cheese merchant, the anonymous brewers and bakers and soup sellers, weren't just feeding people. They were maintaining the social fabric that held communities together. Every transaction was a relationship, every meal a connection, every market day a renewal of the bonds that made survival possible in an uncertain world. Their legacy lives on, not just in the foods we eat, but in the ongoing human need for nourishment that goes beyond mere calories. We still gather around food, still use meals to mark celebrations and comfort sorrows, still find in shared eating a fundamental expression of our humanity. The medieval understanding of fast food as necessity rather than convenience offers lessons for our modern world, grappling with questions of sustainability, community resilience, and food security. Their techniques for preservation, their systems for ensuring fair trade, their integration of food systems with community networks, all of these hold insights for contemporary challenges. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the last embers dying down in Margaret's oven, the final customers making their way home through darkening streets, the quiet satisfaction of another day's work done, another community fed. The medieval world of fast food has ended, but its essence, the human need for nourishment, community, and connection, continues in every meal we share, every vendor we patronize, every bite we take. The fast food of the Middle Ages was indeed a world away from our modern experience, but at its heart lay the same fundamental human activities, feeding ourselves and each other, building communities around shared needs, adapting to circumstances with ingenuity and determination. In understanding their world, we better understand our own. As we reach the end of our journey through the bustling streets and marketplaces of medieval times, I hope you found a comfortable position and are ready to drift off while reflecting on these fascinating parallels between past and present. Don't forget to comment and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most overlooked fast food revolution. The story of medieval fast food ultimately reveals something profound about human nature and our relationship with nourishment. Whether we're grabbing a quick burger from a drive-thru today or purchasing a steaming meat pie from a medieval street vendor, we're participating in the same fundamental human behavior, seeking sustenance that fits our busy lives while connecting with our communities. Consider how both eras developed remarkably similar solutions to the same basic problems. Medieval bakers who prepared dozens of loaves before dawn mirror today's fast food workers who arrive early to prep ingredients for the breakfast rush. The guild systems that regulated quality and prices weren't so different from today's health departments and franchise standards. Even the complaints were similar. Medieval customers grumbled about watered-down ale just as we might complain about a diluted soft drink. Yet the differences remind us how much our world has transformed. Medieval fast food required genuine skill and craftsmanship. A pie maker had to understand not just cooking, but preservation, seasoning, and even basic veterinary knowledge to assess meat quality. Today's fast food worker operates sophisticated equipment, but the actual food preparation has been engineered to require minimal culinary expertise. We've traded individual skill for systematic efficiency. The health risks present another striking contrast. Medieval consumers faced the constant threat of spoiled meat, contaminated water, and questionable ingredients, yet they developed remarkable resilience and knowledge about food safety through necessity. We enjoy unprecedented food safety standards, but perhaps we've lost some of that intuitive understanding our ancestors possessed about ingredients and preparation methods. Most significantly, medieval fast food served as a vital social institution. The tavern wasn't just a place to grab a quick meal, it was a community centre, news hub, and social network all rolled into one. People gathered not just to eat, but to share stories, conduct business, and maintain the social fabric of their communities. Modern fast food, despite its convenience, often isolates us. We eat alone in our cars or grab something quick between activities, missing those deeper connections our ancestors naturally wove into their daily sustenance. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval fast food also offer lessons for our modern world. Medieval people understood that food was intimately connected to time, place, and community. Spring brought fresh herbs and vegetables, summer meant abundant grains, autumn delivered hearty stews and preserved meats for winter. This created a natural variety and appreciation for ingredients that our year-round global food system has largely eliminated. Perhaps most importantly, medieval fast food teaches us about resilience and adaptation. These weren't people with easy lives. They faced constant challenges from weather, disease, war, and economic instability. Yet they created food systems that not only sustained them, but brought joy, community, and even luxury within their constraints. They found ways to make simple ingredients special, to turn necessity into celebration, and to maintain hope and connection even in the darkest times. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that you're part of an unbroken chain of humans who have always found ways to nourish themselves and their communities, no matter the circumstances. The medieval fast food vendors who called out their wares in languages we can barely understand were solving the same problems we face today: how to eat well, live efficiently, and stay connected to the people around us. Sweet dreams, and may your modern fast food adventures be seasoned with appreciation for the remarkable ingenuity of those who came before us.